If you want to know the moment a billionaire realized he had been living beside a miracle without seeing it, it began the night he found his own maid sleeping in a children's playground. The wind moved softly through the empty park on the edge of Whitmore Heights, carrying the distant hum of traffic from the highway nearly 1 mile away. It was close to midnight, and the quiet suburban neighborhood had already settled into sleep. The tall streetlights cast long pale shadows across the swings and metal slides. Daniel Whitmore had not meant to stop there. The billionaire technology investor had been driving home from a late meeting downtown, his black sedan gliding silently through the calm streets, when something unusual caught his eye through the windshield. At first he thought it was a shadow moving across the playground bench. Then the car headlights passed over it for just a second, and he saw the shape clearly. A woman, curled tightly against the cold wooden bench beneath the faded red slide. Daniel slowed the car. For a moment, he simply watched from the road, his fingers resting on the steering wheel as confusion crept slowly across his face. The woman wore a familiar uniform, dark cleaning clothes, a pale gray sweater, white sneakers that looked worn from many miles of walking. His brow tightened as recognition hit him like a quiet shock. That uniform belonged to the staff inside his own mansion. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly, the night air cool against his face as he closed the door without a sound. The gravel path leading toward the playground crunched softly under his polished shoes. Each step brought the figure on the bench into clearer view under the dull yellow glow of the streetlight. Her head rested against a folded jacket that served as a pillow. Her hands were tucked beneath her arms to keep warm. A thin blanket barely covered her legs. Daniel stopped about 20 feet away, staring in disbelief as the truth settled into place. The woman sleeping there in the quiet darkness was Angela Brooks. Angela Brooks cleaned the east wing of his mansion every morning at 7 o'clock sharp. She was always polite, always silent, always careful, not to be noticed. In the entire year she had worked in his home, Daniel could not remember a single complaint about her work. She scrubbed marble floors until they reflected light like glass. She polished silver trays until they looked brand new. And yet now she was here, alone, sleeping outside like someone who had nowhere else to go. A cold breeze pushed through the empty swings, causing one metal seat to sway slowly back and forth with a soft squeak that echoed through the silent park. Angela did not wake. She remained curled on the bench, her breathing slow and steady as if exhaustion had finally pulled her into the only rest she could find. Daniel Whitmore stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the quiet scene before him. He owned 4 houses across the country. His primary mansion alone had more than 20 bedrooms. Yet somehow the woman who cleaned his floors every day was sleeping on a playground bench beneath a rusted slide. And in that strange quiet moment beneath the streetlight, something inside the billionaire shifted for the very first time. Daniel Whitmore did not sleep well that night. The image of Angela Brooks lying on that cold playground bench followed him back to the mansion and stayed with him long after the lights of his bedroom were turned off. His home sat on nearly 5 acres of land, surrounded by tall oak trees and a long curved driveway that stretched almost half a mile from the iron gate to the front entrance. Inside, the house was silent and warm, filled with the quiet comfort that came from wealth built over many years. Yet sometime before sunrise, Daniel stood beside the tall windows of his bedroom, staring out at the faint gray light spreading across the lawns. His mind kept returning to the same question. How long had she been sleeping there? The next morning the mansion woke the way it always did. At exactly 7 o'clock, the cleaning staff began moving through the long hallways. Vacuum motors hummed softly against the marble floors. The faint scent of lemon cleaning solution drifted through the air. Daniel walked downstairs later than usual, his thoughts still heavy from the night before. As he stepped into the east wing corridor, he slowed. Angela Brooks stood at the far end of the hallway, wiping down the tall glass doors that opened toward the garden. Her movements were careful and quiet, the same as every other morning. Her dark hair was tied back neatly. Her gray uniform looked freshly washed. Nothing about her appearance suggested that only a few hours earlier she had been sleeping outside beneath a playground slide. She finished polishing the glass and stepped aside to allow the morning light to shine through the spotless surface. When she turned and saw Daniel standing there, she gave a small respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was calm and steady. Daniel studied her face for a moment. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes that he had never noticed before. Signs of exhaustion hidden beneath the quiet discipline of someone used to enduring long days without complaint. "Good morning, Angela," he replied slowly. For a moment, he considered asking the question that had followed him all night. Instead, he simply nodded and continued walking down the hallway. Angela returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. Later that morning, Daniel stepped into the breakfast room where his 8-year-old daughter Lily sat quietly at the long wooden table. A bowl of cereal rested in front of her, though she had barely touched it. Lily rarely spoke to the staff or to strangers. Since the death of her mother several years earlier, she had grown quiet and withdrawn, communicating mostly through small gestures or simple words. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Good morning, Lily," he said gently. The young girl looked up at him but did not answer. Her attention shifted toward the doorway, just as Angela entered the room carrying a tray with fresh orange juice and sliced fruit. Something subtle changed in Lily the moment she saw her. The little girl straightened slightly in her chair. Angela set the tray down and offered Lily a warm smile. "Good morning, Lily." Lily did not respond with words, but she reached quietly for the glass Angela had placed beside her bowl. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. In the months since Angela had started working at the mansion, Lily had shown more comfort around her than with anyone else in the house. Angela never pushed her to talk. She simply stayed nearby, speaking softly when needed and respecting the child's silence when it appeared. As Angela turned to leave the room, Lily surprised Daniel by whispering a single word. "Stay?" Angela paused near the door and looked back. Daniel saw the smallest hint of warmth cross her face before she nodded gently. "I will be right outside if you need me, Lily." She stepped into the hallway again, leaving the room quiet. Daniel sat there for a long moment watching his daughter slowly begin eating her breakfast. For reasons he could not yet explain, the memory of the empty playground bench returned to him once again. And now the question that had troubled him all night felt even heavier. If Angela Brooks had nowhere to sleep, why had she never said a word? Daniel Whitmore had built his life on a simple belief that the world followed a clear order. Those who worked hard rose higher. Those who struggled simply had not reached their opportunity yet. It was a philosophy that had guided him from a small apartment in Cleveland to the top-floor offices of Whitmore Technologies in Manhattan. By the age of 45, he owned companies across 3 states, employed thousands of people, and lived in a mansion large enough that the West Wing alone could house an entire family. Order and logic had always explained everything in his world. But Angela Brooks did not fit into that order. The question of her sleeping on that playground bench stayed with him through the entire day. By afternoon, Daniel found himself watching the East Wing corridor again through the glass wall of his home office. Angela moved quietly through the hallway with a rolling cart of cleaning supplies. The wheels made a soft sound against the polished floor as she worked her way from room to room. Every motion was careful, every task precise. If anyone had asked Daniel that morning to describe her, he would have said the same thing he always believed about her. Reliable, invisible, efficient. Yet now that he knew what happened after dark, every detail about her seemed different. Daniel leaned back in his chair and pressed a button on the intercom beside his desk. A moment later, the voice of his house manager answered. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Send me the employment file for Angela Brooks," Daniel said. There was a short pause on the other end. "Of course, sir." Within 10 minutes, a thin folder arrived on his desk. Daniel opened it slowly. The file contained only basic information. Angela Brooks, age 32, hired 11 months earlier through a local cleaning agency. Previous employment listed only small service jobs. No disciplinary reports. No complaints. Nothing unusual. Daniel frowned slightly. A person who worked every day inside one of the largest private homes in the county should have left more traces in the world than this. His eyes drifted toward the window again, where the late afternoon sun now cast long shadows across the garden. At that moment, he saw Angela outside, kneeling beside Lily near the stone pathway that led toward the fountain. Lily held a small piece of chalk in her hand. Angela had drawn a large circle on the pavement. Slowly and patiently, she showed the child how to draw another circle beside it. Lily hesitated at first, but then carefully followed the example. Daniel watched as Angela nodded with quiet encouragement. Lily did not laugh loudly the way other children did. She rarely spoke more than a few words. But when Angela was near, something inside her seemed calmer, more open. After a few minutes, Lily looked up and said something so softly Daniel could not hear it through the glass. Angela listened carefully and then answered with a warm smile. The child nodded and continued drawing. Daniel studied the scene for several seconds longer. This woman who slept on a cold bench at night somehow carried more patience and gentleness than most people he had ever hired. A strange feeling crept into his chest. Not pity, something closer to confusion. Because the life he understood had always followed a different rule. People who struggled tended to grow bitter. People who lost comfort rarely had the strength to give kindness to others. Yet Angela Brooks seemed to move through the world with a quiet grace that made no sense at all. As evening approached, the staff began preparing dinner inside the mansion kitchen. Angela quietly finished her final task and placed her cleaning cloth back onto the cart. Daniel watched as she walked down the hallway toward the staff exit at the rear of the house. He checked the time on his desk clock. 6:30 in the evening. That meant she would soon begin the same walk he had unknowingly witnessed the night before. A slow walk through quiet streets toward a playground bench that had somehow become her bedroom. Daniel stood from his chair and stared toward the door she had just passed through. For the first time since building his fortune, he felt the faint pull of something unfamiliar. Curiosity mixed with a quiet sense that he had overlooked something important inside his own home. And that night, without fully understanding why, Daniel Whitmore made a decision. He would follow Angela Brooks after she left the mansion. The sky above Whitmore Heights had already turned deep blue by the time Angela Brooks stepped out of the staff entrance behind the mansion. The evening air carried the quiet smell of fresh grass and distant wood smoke drifting from somewhere in the neighborhood. Angela adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag over her shoulder and began walking down the narrow service road that curved toward the main gate. Inside the house, the dinner lights glowed warmly behind tall windows, but Angela did not look back. Her pace was steady, almost practiced, as if this route had become part of a routine she followed every single night. A few minutes later, the iron gate opened slowly and she stepped onto the quiet suburban street beyond the property line. Daniel Whitmore watched from inside his car parked half a block away beneath a row of maple trees. He had left the mansion through the front driveway 10 minutes earlier and circled around the neighborhood until he reached the road that Angela used to leave the property. Now he sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, observing as she walked down the sidewalk beneath the dim glow of streetlights. Angela did not appear to notice the black sedan parked in the shadows. She walked with the same calm focus Daniel had seen during her work inside the mansion. One step after another, shoulders slightly forward, eyes fixed ahead. Daniel waited until she reached the corner before he quietly started the engine and followed at a distance. The quiet neighborhood slowly changed as Angela continued walking. Large houses with wide lawns gave way to smaller homes built closer together. The sidewalks became cracked in places. Porch lights flickered above modest front doors. After nearly 40 minutes of walking, Angela finally reached the small community park Daniel had seen the night before. The playground stood near the center of the park, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. Daniel parked along the street again and watched as Angela entered the park through a narrow gravel path. He expected her to go directly toward the wooden bench beneath the slide where she had slept the night before. Instead, she stopped beside a trash can near the picnic tables and opened her bag. From inside, she carefully removed several wrapped sandwiches and 2 small bottles of water. Daniel frowned slightly. That was not what he expected. Angela walked toward the far side of the playground where a row of low bushes bordered the edge of the park. There, beneath the faint glow of another streetlight, 2 small figures slowly emerged from the shadows. They were children. A boy who looked around 10 years old and a younger girl perhaps 7 years old. Their clothes were worn and slightly oversized, and both of them moved with the cautious posture of children used to watching the world carefully. Angela knelt down to their level and greeted them with a gentle smile. Daniel could not hear the exact words from where he sat, but the tone of her voice carried softly through the still night air. The boy accepted one of the sandwiches while the younger girl held the water bottle with both hands, as if it were something precious. Angela spoke with them quietly for several minutes, making sure they began eating before she stood again. She brushed a few leaves off the bench and helped the smaller child climb onto it, so she could sit comfortably while finishing her food. The older boy nodded his thanks and sat beside his sister. Daniel remained frozen inside the car. The woman who barely spoke inside his mansion was now kneeling in the dirt beside two children who clearly had nowhere else to go. Angela did not appear hurried or uncomfortable. She waited patiently until both children had eaten most of the sandwiches. Only then did she stand and walk slowly toward the bench beneath the slide. She spread her thin blanket across the wood and sat down, leaning back as the cool wind moved through the quiet park. A moment later, the younger girl stood from the bench near the bushes and walked over to Angela with a shy step. Without hesitation, Angela opened her arms and wrapped the blanket partly around the child's shoulders to keep her warm. The boy remained nearby, watching protectively. Daniel Whitmore felt something tighten deep inside his chest as he witnessed the scene unfolding beneath the soft yellow streetlight. The maid who cleaned his mansion floors every morning was spending her nights feeding hungry children and sharing the only blanket she owned. Daniel Whitmore did not start the car. He remained in the driver's seat with his hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the quiet scene unfold beneath the soft yellow streetlight. The night air had grown colder, and the branches of the tall pine trees surrounding the park swayed slowly in the wind. The two children finished the sandwiches Angela Brooks had given them. The boy carefully folded the wrapper and placed it inside his pocket as if he did not want to leave any trace behind. The younger girl leaned closer to Angela on the wooden bench beneath the slide, the thin blanket now wrapped around both of their shoulders. Angela spoke to them softly, her voice calm and warm in a way Daniel had never heard inside the walls of his mansion. Inside the house, she was always careful, almost invisible. But here, in the quiet darkness of the park, she looked different. Not tired, not invisible, simply present. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his seat, trying to hear their conversation through the partially open window. The older boy spoke first, his voice low and cautious. "Miss Angela, are you sure you do not need this blanket tonight? It is getting colder." Angela shook her head gently. "I will be fine," she said. "You keep it around your sister's shoulders for a while longer." The little girl rested her head against Angela's arm, clearly comfortable beside her. Daniel felt the strange weight in his chest grow heavier. The maid who cleaned the marble floors of his mansion every morning was sitting on a rough playground bench sharing warmth with children who had nowhere else to go. And the most unsettling part was that Angela did it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No hesitation, no complaint. After a few minutes, Angela stood slowly and walked a few steps toward the trash can near the picnic tables. She reached inside her bag again and pulled out a small folded sweater. When she returned, she draped it carefully around the boy's shoulders. The boy looked surprised. "Miss Angela, you need that more than I do." Angela smiled gently and shook her head again. "I work indoors tomorrow morning," she said. "You will be outside tonight." The boy lowered his eyes and nodded quietly. The little girl yawned softly beneath the blanket. Angela brushed a few strands of hair from the child's face with a patient kindness that reminded Daniel of something he had not seen in years. The way Lily's mother used to comfort her before she passed away. Daniel swallowed slowly as the memory surfaced. For several minutes, none of them spoke. The only sounds in the park were the slow creak of a metal swing moving gently in the wind and the distant rumble of a truck passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Eventually, Angela sat back down on the wooden bench beneath the slide. She leaned against the cold metal frame and closed her eyes for a moment, though she did not appear fully asleep. The children remained nearby, sitting quietly with the blanket still wrapped around them. Daniel realized then that Angela had not kept a single sandwich for herself. She had given all of them away. The truth landed inside his mind with quiet force. The woman who had almost nothing was still giving away what little she had. Daniel felt a deep and unfamiliar discomfort settle over him. All his life, he had believed generosity came from abundance. Wealth created the ability to help others. That was the logic he had used to justify every decision he made while building his empire. Yet here in this quiet playground sat a woman who owned almost nothing and still found a way to share more kindness than most people he knew. Daniel glanced toward the back seat of his car, where his leather briefcase rested beside a neatly folded coat that cost more than Angela's entire monthly salary. For the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore felt something that did not fit easily inside his carefully ordered view of the world. It was not guilt. Not yet. But it was something close. something uncomfortable enough that he could not simply drive away and forget what he had seen. And as he watched Angela Brooks gently adjust the blanket around the two tired children beneath the pale glow of the streetlight, Daniel Whitmore realized a quiet truth that unsettled him deeply. The person with the least comfort in the entire city might also be the most generous soul he had ever met. Daniel Whitmore did not realize how long he had remained parked along the quiet street. The dashboard clock inside his car showed that nearly 1 hour had passed since Angela Brooks first shared the sandwiches with the two children beneath the playground slide. The park had grown even quieter. The wind had softened, and the faint glow of the streetlights painted long pale shadows across the gravel path. The younger girl eventually drifted to sleep with her head resting against Angela's shoulder, the thin blanket still wrapped around both of them. The older boy remained awake for a while longer, sitting nearby on the edge of the wooden bench with his arms folded tightly against the cold. Angela spoke to him quietly, her voice calm and patient. Daniel could not hear every word, but he saw the boy nod slowly as she spoke. After several minutes, the boy stretched out beside his sister, using his folded jacket as a pillow. Angela carefully adjusted the blanket once more to make sure both children were covered before leaning back against the metal frame of the slide. She did not lie down completely. Instead, she remained sitting upright, as if staying alert through the night in case the children needed her. Daniel finally started the engine of his car and drove slowly away from the park. The quiet road ahead seemed different now. The same houses, the same sidewalks, the same quiet trees lining the street. Yet something about the night felt heavier inside his mind. By the time Daniel returned to the mansion, the kitchen staff had already finished cleaning up from dinner. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. Daniel walked through the dark hallway and paused outside the door of Lily's bedroom. A soft light glowed beneath the door frame. He opened it gently and stepped inside. Lily sat on the floor beside her bed, quietly arranging small wooden blocks into careful rows across the carpet. She looked up when Daniel entered the room. "Hello, Lily," he said softly. The girl did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied his face for a moment with the quiet focus she often showed when observing people. Then she asked a simple question. "Where is Angela?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Angela went home after work," he said. Lily looked down at the blocks again and moved one piece carefully into place. She spoke again without raising her eyes. "Angela does not go home." Daniel felt a sudden chill move through his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked gently. Lily paused for a moment, as if choosing the right words. "Angela walks far. Then she sleeps outside." Daniel stood very still beside the bed. "How do you know that, Lily?" The little girl finally looked up at him again. "I saw her one night from the window," she said quietly. "She was leaving through the garden gate with a bag. I asked Angela the next morning if she was cold outside." Lily's voice softened as she continued. "Angela told me sometimes people do not have houses, but they still have kindness." The room fell silent for several seconds. Daniel slowly sat down on the edge of the bed beside his daughter. "Did Angela say anything else?" he asked. Lily nodded once. "She said being kind is more important than being comfortable." Daniel stared at the wooden blocks scattered across the carpet as the words settled into his thoughts. For most of his life, he had believed comfort created kindness. Wealth created generosity. The more resources a person had, the easier it became to help others. Yet tonight he had watched a woman with almost nothing share her only food and blanket with two children who needed it more. Lily suddenly picked up one of the blocks and held it out toward him. "This one is Angela," she said softly. Daniel accepted the small wooden block and turned it slowly in his hand. In that quiet moment inside his daughter's bedroom, Daniel Whitmore realized something deeply unsettling about the world he thought he understood. The person who had the least inside his entire household might also be the one teaching his daughter the most important lesson about what it meant to care for another human being. The next morning arrived with the same quiet routine inside the Whitmore mansion, but something inside Daniel Whitmore had shifted during the night. He woke earlier than usual, long before the sunlight touched the tall windows overlooking the gardens. For several minutes, he simply sat at the edge of his bed, remembering the image of Angela Brooks sitting beneath the playground slide with two tired children leaning against her shoulders. The memory refused to leave his mind. Daniel finally stood and dressed for the day, though the calm certainty that usually guided his mornings felt strangely unsettled. Downstairs, the house had begun to stir with the quiet rhythm of staff starting their work. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the hallway as Daniel walked toward the kitchen. When he entered the east wing corridor, he slowed his steps again. Angela was already there, just as she was every morning at 7 o'clock. She stood beside the tall windows, wiping down the glass with a clean cloth, allowing the early sunlight to reflect across the polished floor. To anyone passing through the hallway, she looked exactly the same as always. Quiet, focused, invisible. But now Daniel could not see her the same way. He paused near the doorway and watched her work for a moment before speaking. Angela. She turned immediately, her posture straight and respectful. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Her voice carried the same calm tone he had heard countless times before. Daniel studied her face carefully. There were faint signs of fatigue beneath her eyes, yet she still managed to offer a polite smile, as if the long night had never happened. Angela, he said slowly, I would like to ask you something. Of course, sir, she replied. Daniel hesitated for a moment before choosing his words. Do you walk home every night after work? Angela blinked once, clearly surprised by the question. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider her answer carefully. Yes, sir, she said. I usually take a walk after my shift. It helps me clear my mind. Daniel nodded slowly, though the explanation did not match what he had seen with his own eyes. That must be a long walk, he said quietly. Angela lowered her gaze slightly, but did not answer. The hallway fell silent except for the faint hum of the air vent above them. Daniel suddenly realized something important in that moment. Angela was not hiding her situation because she was ashamed. She was protecting something. Her job. The stability that allowed her to keep working inside the mansion. After several seconds, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer now. Angela, if there is ever something you need, you can speak to the house manager. We try to take care of our staff here. Angela nodded politely, but her expression remained gentle and reserved. Thank you, sir, she said. That means a great deal. She returned to wiping the glass doors as if the conversation had ended. Daniel remained standing there for a moment longer, unsure what to say next. The truth he had witnessed the night before felt too personal to confront directly. Finally, he turned and continued walking down the hallway toward the breakfast room. A few minutes later, Angela entered the room, carrying a tray of fruit for Lily. The child was already sitting quietly at the table. When Lily saw her, she looked up immediately. Angela walked over and placed the plate beside her. Good morning, Lily. The girl studied her face closely for a moment. Then she asked a question in her soft voice. Did you sleep outside again? Angela froze slightly, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the child's words. Daniel looked up from his coffee cup, his attention fixed on Angela's response. Angela knelt beside Lily's chair and spoke gently. Sometimes people rest in different places, she said calmly. What matters is that we wake up ready to help others. Lily considered the answer for a moment and then nodded slowly as if it made perfect sense to her. Daniel watched the quiet exchange unfold in front of him. Angela had not denied the truth. She had simply transformed it into a lesson of kindness for his daughter. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore realized something that unsettled him even more deeply than the night before. The woman who slept on a cold playground bench might also be the strongest person inside his entire household. The day moved forward inside the Whitmore mansion with its usual quiet rhythm, but Daniel Whitmore could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. The conversation he witnessed between Angela Brooks and his daughter lingered in his thoughts long after breakfast ended. Lily had returned to stacking her wooden blocks on the carpet, humming softly to herself, while Angela continued her work in the hallway with the same steady patience she showed every morning. To anyone else in the house, it was an ordinary day. But to Daniel, it felt like he had suddenly discovered a hidden room inside his own home that he had never noticed before. By late afternoon, the sky outside had begun turning the pale golden color that always appeared before sunset. Daniel stood beside the tall glass wall of his office once again, watching the garden below. Lily sat on the stone pathway with a box of colored chalk beside her. Angela knelt nearby, showing her how to draw careful shapes on the pavement. Lily rarely allowed anyone close to her during these quiet afternoon moments. Yet with Angela, she seemed calm and focused. Daniel noticed how Angela never rushed the child. She waited patiently for Lily to finish each drawing before suggesting the next one. Sometimes she simply sat beside her in silence. After a while, Lily placed the chalk down and looked toward Angela. Angela drew a small star-shaped pattern in the dust beside the chalk lines using only the tip of her finger. Lily smiled faintly and copied the pattern beside it. Daniel felt an unexpected warmth watching the scene through the glass. For the first time since his wife passed away several years earlier, he had seen Lily look completely at ease with another person. Yet that warmth was quickly followed by a deeper discomfort. Because the woman patiently teaching his daughter to draw shapes on the garden path would soon leave the warmth of this house and walk nearly 1 mile through the dark streets toward a playground bench. The contradiction made Daniel uneasy in a way he could not ignore. As evening approached, the staff began finishing their work for the day. Angela placed the chalk box back onto the small table near the garden door and gently brushed the dust from Lily's hands. Lily looked up at her with quiet seriousness. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Angela smiled softly. "Yes, Lily. I will see you in the morning." The little girl nodded, but then added another question. "Will you be cold tonight?" Angela paused for a brief moment before answering. "Sometimes the air gets cold at night," she said gently. "But cold weather does not last forever." Lily seemed satisfied with the answer. She stood and walked slowly back toward the house. Daniel stepped away from the window as Angela entered the hallway carrying her cleaning cart. He walked toward her with a steady expression, though his mind was already turning through several thoughts at once. "Angela," he said calmly. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. I would like you to take tomorrow afternoon off." He continued. Angela looked slightly surprised. "Is something wrong with my work, sir?" "No," Daniel replied quickly. "Your work is excellent. I simply think you deserve a break." Angela hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to respond. "That is very generous of you, sir," she said. "But I do not mind working." Daniel gave a small nod. "I understand. But I would still like you to take the afternoon. Consider it a personal day." Angela finally nodded politely. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." As she turned to continue her tasks, Daniel watched her quietly for a moment. He had not yet told her that he knew about the playground. He had not mentioned the 2 children she cared for each night. But inside his mind a decision had begun forming slowly and carefully. Daniel Whitmore had spent most of his life solving problems with money and influence. Yet for the first time he realized that the situation unfolding before him required something more thoughtful than simply writing a check. If he wanted to truly understand Angela Brooks, he would need to see the world the way she did. And that meant returning to the playground once again when the night grew quiet. The following evening the air over Whitmore Heights carried a colder edge than the night before. Thin clouds drifted across the sky, dimming the moonlight and leaving the quiet streets wrapped in a soft gray shadow. Daniel Whitmore drove slowly through the neighborhood once again, his headlights sweeping across empty sidewalks and silent houses. He did not rush this time. The decision he made earlier that afternoon had settled firmly in his mind. If he truly wanted to understand Angela Brooks, he had to witness the truth of her life without interruption. When Daniel reached the small community park, he parked along the same curb beneath the tall maple trees. The playground sat ahead in the same quiet stillness as before. The metal swings moved gently in the breeze, producing a faint creaking sound that echoed through the empty space. Daniel turned off the engine and watched. A few minutes later, Angela appeared at the far end of the gravel path, walking toward the playground with the same worn canvas bag resting against her shoulder. She moved with steady purpose, her steps careful but familiar as if she had traveled this path many nights before. When she reached the picnic table, she paused and opened her bag. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his seat, observing every movement. Once again, Angela removed several wrapped sandwiches along with a small container of fruit slices. She set them neatly on the table and looked toward the bushes at the edge of the park. The 2 children appeared almost immediately, stepping cautiously out from the shadows. The older boy gave a small wave when he saw her. Angela knelt down to greet them with the same warm smile Daniel had witnessed the night before. Tonight the wind was stronger, and the little girl wrapped her arms tightly around herself as she approached. Angela noticed immediately. She removed her sweater without hesitation and gently placed it around the child's shoulders before handing her one of the sandwiches. The girl looked up with wide, grateful eyes. Daniel felt his chest tighten again as he watched the quiet exchange. Angela had arrived wearing only a thin shirt beneath that sweater. The night air was cold enough that Daniel could see faint breath rising from the children's mouths as they spoke. Yet Angela never seemed to hesitate before giving away the warmest thing she owned. The children sat together at the picnic table while Angela stood nearby, making sure they finished eating. The older boy spoke to her in a serious tone. Daniel caught a few fragments of the conversation through the open car window. He heard the boy say that they might have to leave the park soon because a security guard had been asking questions in the neighborhood. Angela listened carefully and then nodded. She spoke to them quietly for several moments before walking back to the bench beneath the slide. Instead of sitting down, she pulled something small from her bag. It was a folded piece of paper. She returned to the children and handed it to the boy. The boy unfolded it slowly. Even from the distance, Daniel could see it was a simple map drawn in blue pen. Angela pointed to a location on the paper and explained something patiently. The boy studied the map and nodded several times. The little girl leaned closer, watching with curious attention. Daniel realized that Angela was not only feeding them. She was helping them plan a safer place to stay. After the children finished their food, Angela gathered the empty wrappers and placed them back inside her bag so the park would remain clean. The boy thanked her quietly. The little girl gave Angela a small hug before stepping back toward the bushes where they had first appeared. Daniel watched as the children disappeared into the darkness at the far edge of the park. Angela remained standing there for a moment beneath the dim streetlight, her thin shirt moving slightly in the cold wind now that her sweater was gone. Finally, she returned to the wooden bench beneath the slide and sat down slowly. She leaned back against the metal frame and looked up at the cloudy sky above the playground. Inside his car, Daniel Whitmore felt a deep realization settle over him with undeniable clarity. The woman he had hired to clean his floors had quietly been protecting two vulnerable children every single night while asking for nothing in return. And for the first time since discovering her secret, Daniel understood that the kindness he had witnessed was not an accident. It was the way Angela Brooks chose to live her life. Daniel Whitmore remained in the car long after the two children disappeared into the darkness at the edge of the park. The cold wind moved quietly across the empty playground, brushing against the metal slide and rattling the chains of the swings with a soft, hollow sound. Angela Brooks sat alone on the wooden bench beneath the slide, her shoulders slightly hunched against the cold night air. Without the sweater she had given to the little girl, the thin fabric of her shirt moved gently in the breeze. Yet she did not complain. She simply folded her arms and leaned back against the metal frame, looking up at the cloudy sky as if she had learned long ago how to rest, even in uncomfortable places. Daniel stared at her through the windshield, the faint glow of the streetlight reflecting across the glass. For the first time in many years, he felt something unfamiliar building inside his chest. It was not confusion anymore. It was something heavier, something that forced him to confront a quiet truth about himself. For years, Daniel had believed he understood generosity. His company donated millions of dollars every year to hospitals and community programs. His name appeared on plaques in buildings across 3 states. He had always assumed that made him a generous man. Yet tonight, he had watched a woman with no home give away her food, her sweater, and the only blanket she owned without hesitation. And she had done it quietly, without recognition, without reward, and without anyone even knowing. Daniel slowly opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel path. The cool air brushed against his face as he walked toward the playground. Each step felt strangely heavy, as if he were crossing an invisible line between the comfortable world he had always known and a reality he had ignored for far too long. Angela did not notice him at first. She remained seated on the bench with her eyes half closed, resting after the long day of work and the quiet responsibility she carried each night. Daniel stopped a few feet away before speaking. Angela. Her eyes opened immediately. She straightened slightly when she recognized the familiar voice. Mr. Whitmore. Her surprise was clear, but she did not appear frightened. She simply looked at him with calm curiosity, as if she were waiting to understand why the owner of the mansion where she worked was suddenly standing in the middle of a quiet playground late at night. Daniel hesitated for a moment before continuing. I have been here for a while, he said quietly. I saw everything. Angela lowered her gaze briefly, not in shame, but in quiet acceptance. The wind moved through the trees above them, scattering a few dry leaves across the gravel path. I did not mean for you to see this part of my life, she said softly. Daniel shook his head slowly. You have nothing to apologize for. He paused before adding another sentence that surprised even himself. If anyone should apologize tonight, it is me. Angela looked up again, confusion crossing her face. Daniel took another step closer. I have spent years believing that helping people meant writing large checks and funding programs from behind a desk. But what you are doing here every night is something entirely different. Angela said nothing. She simply listened. Daniel continued speaking, his voice quieter than it had ever been during any board meeting or public speech. You work inside my home every day. You help my daughter feel safe when most people cannot reach her. And then every night you walk here and protect children who have no one else. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly as the full weight of the realization settled inside him. Angela Brooks looked down at her hands resting on the thin blanket beside her. These children need someone, she said gently. Sometimes the world moves too fast to notice the ones who fall behind. Daniel glanced toward the dark bushes where the two children had disappeared earlier. The quiet park suddenly felt larger and colder than before. When he looked back at Angela, he realized something that made his chest ache in a way he had never experienced. The strongest person he had met in many years was sitting on a cold wooden bench with no house to go home to. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore felt the first quiet crack in the carefully built walls of his own pride. The cold wind continued moving through the empty playground as Daniel Whitmore stood beside the wooden bench where Angela Brooks rested beneath the metal slide. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that appears when two people suddenly see the truth of each other for the first time. Daniel looked at the thin blanket beside Angela and then at the long empty stretch of park around them. The gravel path was quiet. The street beyond the trees held no traffic at this late hour. Everything about the scene felt simple and real in a way that the boardrooms and offices of Daniel life never had. Angela finally broke the silence with a calm voice. Mr. Whitmore, you should go home. The night air is getting colder. Daniel gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a tired laugh. I have many houses to choose from tonight, Angela, he said gently. You are the one who does not. Angela did not answer immediately. She simply folded the thin blanket across her lap and looked toward the bushes where the two children had disappeared earlier. They are safe tonight, she said softly. That is what matters. Daniel watched her face carefully. The quiet strength in her expression did not come from pride or stubbornness. It came from someone who had accepted hardship as a normal part of life and had chosen to remain kind anyway. Daniel slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small set of keys and held them loosely in his hand. Angela noticed the motion and looked up. There is a small guest house on the east side of my property, Daniel said. It has been empty for several years. It is warm. It has a bed. A kitchen. Everything someone would need to sleep comfortably. Angela immediately shook her head before he could continue. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your kindness, but I cannot accept that. Daniel frowned slightly. Why not? Because if I move into your property, people will ask questions. I need this job. If the staff believe I am receiving special treatment, it will create problems for everyone. Daniel considered her answer carefully. Even now, she was thinking about protecting the stability of her work rather than improving her own comfort. Angela continued, speaking quietly. This bench may not look like much, but it allows me to keep working. And the children know where to find me. Daniel looked again toward the dark trees at the edge of the park. The image of the two small figures standing beside Angela returned clearly in his mind. What are their names? He asked softly. The boy is named Marcus and the little girl is Elena, Angela replied. They lost their mother last year. Since then they moved between shelters and the streets depending on what space is available. Daniel lowered his gaze for a moment. The quiet sadness of the story settled heavily inside his chest. Angela watched his expression and then added gently. They are good children. They just need time and someone to remind them that the world has not forgotten them. Daniel looked back at her. Angela Brooks was sitting on a rough wooden bench wearing only a thin shirt in the cold night air. Yet she spoke about these children with a calm hope that made Daniel feel both humbled and ashamed. After a moment, he spoke again. Angela, if you will not accept the guest house, then allow me to help another way. Angela studied his face with cautious curiosity. Daniel continued slowly, choosing his words with care. Tomorrow morning, I will contact a local housing program that works with families and children who need stable shelter. Marcus and Elena deserve a place that is safe and warm every night. Angela's eyes widened slightly. She had spent months helping the children survive one night at a time, but the possibility of something permanent clearly surprised her. Daniel added quietly, And as for you, Angela, I will not force you to leave this bench if that is what you choose. But please understand something. After tonight, I cannot pretend that I do not know the truth. Angela looked down at the blanket again as the wind moved gently through the trees above them. For the first time since Daniel had approached her, she seemed unsure of what to say. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the bench in the quiet playground, realizing that this simple conversation had already begun changing the way he understood both kindness and responsibility. The wind softened as the night deepened around the quiet playground. Dry leaves rolled slowly across the gravel path, and the faint glow of the streetlight cast long shadows beneath the metal slide where Angela Brooks sat beside Daniel Whitmore. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The conversation they had just shared lingered heavily in the cool air, filled with thoughts that neither of them had expected to confront that night. Angela looked down at the thin blanket folded across her lap, her hands resting gently on the worn fabric. She had spent many nights on that bench, but never before had someone from her daytime world stepped into the quiet reality she lived after dark. Daniel stood beside the bench with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out toward the dark edge of the park where Marcus and Elena had disappeared earlier. He had spent most of his life solving problems with money and influence. Yet standing there in the cold, he understood that this moment required something deeper than simple charity. Angela finally spoke softly. "Mr. Whitmore, you did not have to come here tonight. Most people would have turned away and never asked questions." Daniel gave a slow breath and shook his head. "I spent many years believing that helping people meant building foundations and writing checks from comfortable offices," he said quietly. "Tonight, I realized something different." Angela looked up at him with calm curiosity. Daniel continued speaking with a steady voice that carried more honesty than any speech he had given at a corporate conference. "I have lived in this city for more than 20 years. I built companies here. I funded programs that appear in newspapers and reports. Yet somehow I never noticed the quiet struggles happening only a few miles away from my own front door." Angela listened without interrupting. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Daniel glanced again toward the trees. "When you spoke about Marcus and Elena earlier, you did not sound angry about what happened to them," he said. Angela shook her head gently. "Anger does not help children sleep at night," she replied. "What they need most is someone who reminds them that tomorrow can still be better." Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly as he heard the simple truth in her words. He lowered his gaze for a moment before speaking again. "Tomorrow morning, I will call the housing program I mentioned earlier. I will personally make sure Marcus and Elena are given priority placement. They deserve stability and a place where they can grow without fear." Angela's eyes softened with quiet relief. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. That means more than you know." Daniel hesitated for a moment before adding another sentence. "But there is something else I would like to do." Angela waited silently. Daniel took a small step closer to the bench so she could see the seriousness in his expression. "The guest house on my property will remain open to you whenever you decide you are ready. No questions. No conditions. It will simply be there when you need warmth and rest." Angela looked down again, considering his words carefully. For the first time since he had approached her, she seemed deeply moved by the offer. "I do not know if I deserve that kind of kindness," she said softly. Daniel responded immediately with a gentle but certain voice. "Angela, you have spent months giving kindness to people who had nothing to offer you in return. If anyone deserves a warm place to sleep, it is you." The wind passed through the trees again, brushing softly across the quiet playground. Angela slowly lifted her eyes toward him. "I will think about it," she said. Daniel nodded with understanding. "That is all I ask." They remained there for several minutes in thoughtful silence. Above them the clouds began to thin and a few small stars appeared in the night sky. The quiet park no longer felt quite as lonely as it had before. For the first time in many nights, Angela was not facing the cold darkness alone. And for the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore felt that the wealth he had built might finally be guiding him towards something truly meaningful. Morning sunlight spread slowly across Whitmore Heights several days later, warming the tall oak trees and quiet streets surrounding the mansion. The early light reflected softly across the wide windows of the Whitmore estate as the household began another calm morning. Inside the garden path, Lily Whitmore sat on the stone walkway holding a small box of colored chalk, carefully drawing wide circles across the pavement just as she had done many afternoons before. But something about this morning felt different. The garden door opened gently, and Angela Brooks stepped outside carrying a tray with 2 glasses of orange juice. Lily looked up immediately when she saw her, and a small smile appeared on the young girl's face. Angela walked over and set the tray beside her before kneeling on the warm stone path. "Good morning, Lily," she said softly. The little girl studied her carefully and then asked the question she had been waiting to ask for several days. "Did you sleep inside last night?" Angela paused for a moment and then nodded slowly. "Yes, Lily, I did." The guest house on the far side of the Whitmore property had been cleaned and prepared the day after Daniel visited the playground. At first, Angela hesitated to accept the offer, but after several long conversations, she finally agreed to stay there for a while. The small house had a warm bed, a simple kitchen, and a quiet porch that looked out toward the garden trees. It was not large or luxurious compared to the mansion, but to Angela it felt like something she had not experienced in many months. "Safety." Lily nodded thoughtfully as if the answer made perfect sense. Then she handed Angela a piece of chalk. "Draw with me," she said quietly. Angela smiled and began sketching a careful shape beside Lily's circles. A few yards away, Daniel Whitmore stood on the garden steps watching them. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees as he observed the scene with quiet reflection. Over the past few days, many things had changed. The housing program Daniel contacted had located a small family shelter where Marcus and Elena were now staying with the support of trained counselors and teachers. They had warm beds and regular meals for the first time in many months. Angela still visited them in the evenings, bringing books and helping them with homework while the program worked to secure long-term housing for the children. Daniel had also made a quiet decision about the guest house. It would remain Angela's home for as long as she needed it. There were no contracts, no expectations, and no publicity surrounding the arrangement. It was simply the right thing to do. Angela finished her drawing beside Lily and brushed a little chalk dust from her hands. Daniel walked slowly toward them across the stone path. Lily looked up when he approached. "Daddy," she said softly. Daniel knelt beside his daughter and studied the drawings on the pavement. Circles and shapes stretched across the stone like a quiet map of imagination. Angela stood beside them with a calm expression. Daniel looked at her for a moment and then spoke with a quiet sincerity that surprised even himself. "Angela, the house has been warmer since you arrived." Angela smiled gently. "Sometimes warmth does not come from buildings, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes it comes from people who choose to care." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the deeper truth behind her words. The billionaire who once believed kindness could only come from wealth had learned something far more powerful. A woman who once slept on a playground bench had quietly reminded him what real compassion looked like. As the morning sunlight grew brighter across the garden, Lily continued drawing on the pavement while Angela sat beside her and Daniel watched quietly nearby. And in that peaceful moment, Daniel Whitmore realized something he would never forget. She had not asked the world to change for her. But by choosing kindness even in the coldest nights, Angela Brooks had changed the heart of one man. And sometimes, one changed heart is where a better world begins.